The recycled air of an airplane cabin holds a unique tension, a silent agreement between strangers to coexist in a pressurized tube for a few hours. But on Apex Air Flight 7 and 14, that tension was about to break. It wouldn't be the baby crying in row 22, or the turbulence over the Rockies that shattered the peace. It would be the voice of a senior flight attendant, dripping with venom, directed at a 16-year-old girl who just wanted to get to her grandmother's house. The attendant had power, a uniform, and the authority of the airline behind her. The girl had a phone, and in her contacts was one number that could bring this entire multi-million-dollar aircraft and the attendant's career to a screeching halt on the tarmac. You are about to hear how a quiet, unassuming teenager, pushed too far, unleashed a storm of perfectly executed ice-cold karma. The journey of Apollo Trent began as uneventfully as 1,000 others at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. At 16, she was a seasoned traveler, accustomed to the solo flight to San Diego to visit her grandmother for the fall break. She was tall for her age, with her hair styled in intricate box braids that fell just past her shoulders, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her years. Her father, David Trent, had drilled the rules of solo travel into her since she was 12. Be polite, be aware, keep your documents secure, and never draw unnecessary attention to yourself. Today she was following those rules to the letter. She navigated the bustling terminal with practiced ease, her noise-cancelling headphones creating a bubble of calm amidst the chaos. Her carry-on, a sleek black roller bag, was perfectly sized. Her backpack, containing her laptop, a book, and a sketchbook, was compact. She was the model passenger. Boarding for Apex Air Flight 714 began on time. Apollo was in boarding group 3. As she waited, she noticed the lead flight attendant at the gate podium, a woman who looked to be in her late 40s. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe tight bun, and her face was set in a mask of stern impatience. Her name tag read Flora. She was tapping a pen against the counter, with a rapid, irritated rhythm, her eyes scanning the crowd of passengers as if they were a herd of unruly cattle. Apollo watched as Flora snapped at an elderly man who was slow to present his boarding pass, her voice a sharp, cutting instrument. An uneasy feeling settled in Apollo's stomach. It was the kind of feeling she'd been taught to recognize the subtle signal that someone in a position of authority was having a bad day and looking for a place to unload it. When her group was called, Apollo joined the line, her boarding pass ready on her phone. As she stepped up to the scanner, Flora's eyes flickered over her from her braids to her sneakers, pausing for a fraction of a second too long on her backpack. "That's 2 items, Flora," said her voice flat. "1 roller and 1 personal item." "Yes, ma'am," Apollo replied politely. "This is my personal item." Flora's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "Looks a little big for a personal item. We're going to be tight on space today. You might have to check your roller." "It fits perfectly, under the seat," Apollo said, her voice steady. "I fly with it all the time. We'll see about that." Flora sniffed, gesturing her through without another glance. Apollo walked down the jet bridge, shaking off the strange hostility. It was probably nothing. The woman was just stressed. She found her seat 18B a middle seat. Her roller bag slid effortlessly into the overhead bin, and just as she'd said, her backpack fit neatly under the seat in front of her, with room to spare. She settled in, pulling out her book, hoping to disappear into its pages for the next 4 hours. The window seat was occupied by a kind-faced woman who gave her a warm smile and the aisle seat was soon taken by a businessman who immediately buried his face in his phone. The boarding process continued, and Apollo could hear Flora's sharp, commanding voice moving up and down the aisle. "Sir, that needs to go all the way in. Ma'am, your bag cannot be in your lap for takeoff. Hurry along, please, we have a schedule to keep." Her tone wasn't just efficient, it was abrasive, bordering on hostile. About 10 minutes before the scheduled departure, a frantic family of 4 hustled down the aisle, flustered and apologetic. They had a mountain of carry-on luggage. Flora's face tightened with fury. "You're the last ones to board, and now we have no space," she announced loudly, her voice echoing in the now quiet cabin. "This is exactly why we ask people to be on time." The father, looking mortified, tried to cram a duffel bag into a bin that was clearly full. This was when Flora's eyes landed on Apollo's bin. It contained Apollo's small roller and a couple of jackets. It had space. Flora marched over. "You," she said, pointing a manicured finger at Apollo, "your bag needs to be checked." Apollo looked up from her book, confused. "I'm sorry. This bin is needed for the family that was late," Flora said, her voice laced with a strange, accusatory tone. "Your bag is coming out. We'll check it to San Diego." "But there's room in here," Apollo said, softly, gesturing to the space next to her bag. "I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft." Flora snapped, her voice rising in volume. "I decide how the space is utilized. I am not going to play luggage Tetris because you brought a bag that should have been checked in the first place. Now give me your bag." The woman in the window seat. Susan leaned over. "Excuse me," she said to Flora. "There's plenty of room. Her bag is not the problem." Flora shot Susan a venomous glare. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay out of official crew business." She turned back to Apollo, her eyes narrowed. "Are you going to comply, or are we going to have a problem?" Apollo's heart began to pound. Every instinct, every lesson from her father screamed at her to de-escalate. "Be polite. Don't make a scene." She took a deep breath. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll get it down." As Apollo stood up to retrieve her bag, Flora impatiently reached up, grabbed the handle, and yanked it out of the bin with such force that it stumbled from her grasp. The bag fell, hitting the armrest of the aisle seat with a loud crack before tumbling to the floor. The contents of an outer pocket, a small pouch containing her drawing pencils, and a few personal items spilled across the carpeted aisle. A collective gasp went through the nearby rows. Flora didn't apologize. She just looked down at the mess with disgust. "See what you made me do?" She hissed, her voice low and furious for Apollo's ears only. "Clean that up. Now. You're holding up the entire flight." Humiliation washed over Apollo in a hot, sickening wave. Her pencils, a special set her grandmother had given her, were scattered like pickup sticks in the aisle. Her lip balm had rolled under the seat opposite. Her privacy felt violated, her dignity stripped away in front of 100 strangers, all for a bag that had fit perfectly. She knelt, her cheeks burning, and began to gather her things. The businessman in the aisle seat awkwardly shifted his feet, trying not to get in her way, but offering no help. Susan, the woman by the window, however, was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "That was completely uncalled for," Susan said, her voice firm, as she bent down to help Apollo. "Let me help you, dear." "Ma'am, return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt," Flora commanded, pointing at Susan. "You are interfering with a crew member in the performance of her duties. You just assaulted a child's property and publicly shamed her. Susan shot back, not backing down. "I am helping her clean up the mess you made." Flora's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. The pretense of professionalism was gone, replaced by something raw and ugly. She turned her full fury back on Apollo, who was now shoving the last of her pencils back into the pouch. "This is your fault." Flora spat, her voice now loud enough for half the plane to hear clearly. "You and your attitude. From the moment you walked on here with your oversized bag and your music blasting, I knew you'd be a problem." Apollo froze her hand, hovering over the last pencil. Music blasting. Her headphones had been around her neck, silent since she'd sat down. Oversized bag. It had been proven to fit. These weren't just false accusations. They were targeted, designed to paint her as a troublemaker, a stereotype. "My headphones weren't on." "Apollo," said her voice, shaking slightly but clear. "And the bag fits the size requirements." "Don't you talk back to me," Flora snarled. Her eyes raked over Apollo, taking in her braids, her dark skin, her simple hoodie and jeans. The subtext was thick and suffocating. It was an old, familiar poison, one Apollo's parents had warned her she would inevitably face. She just never imagined it would be at 30,000 feet from someone meant to ensure her safety. "Girls like you always think the rules don't apply to them," Flora continued, her voice rising with each word. "You think you can just waltz on here and do whatever you want. Well, not on my flight. Not today. You want to act like you're entitled. I'll show you what happens." The cabin was now deathly silent, save for Flora's tirade. Every passenger was watching a captive audience to a public dressing down. Some looked away uncomfortable. Others stared with wide, shocked eyes. Apollo felt like a specimen under a microscope. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a spectacle. She finally stood up, her small bag now in her hand, ready to be handed over and checked. She clutched her backpack to her chest like a shield. She looked Flora directly in the eye, her own expression a mixture of fear, hurt, and a spark of defiance she couldn't extinguish. She wouldn't cry. She would not give this woman the satisfaction. "Just take the bag." Apollo said, her voice quiet but firm. Flora snatched the bag from her hand. "I'll be having a word with the captain about your disruptive behavior," she threatened. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for non-compliance." She then turned on her heel and stormed toward the front of the aircraft, with Apollo's roller bag, leaving a wake of stunned silence. Susan put a comforting hand on Apollo's arm. "Are you all right, honey?" That was monstrous." Apollo could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She sank back into her seat, the world seeming to tilt and swim around her. She wasn't a problem passenger. She was a kid trying to visit her grandma. And she had just been racially profiled and verbally attacked by a person in power for no reason at all. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. The businessman in the aisle seat finally spoke, his voice a low mutter. "You should report her." Apollo looked at him, then at Susan, who was nodding in vigorous agreement. "Report her." "Yes, but to whom?" "To the other flight attendants who watched and did nothing. To the captain who would only hear Flora's twisted version of events first. A standard customer complaint form felt laughably inadequate for the venom she had just endured. It would be her word against a senior crew member's. And that's when she remembered her father's other rule, the one reserved for emergencies. If you are ever in a situation where you are being mistreated and no one in charge will listen, you call me. Immediately. Don't wait. This felt like that situation. Flora had threatened to report her. She had created a narrative where Apollo was the aggressor. Flora wasn't just being a bully. She was actively creating a false official record of the incident. This was no longer just about a bag or a rude comment. It was about her safety and her reputation. As the forward cabin door was closed and the announcement came to turn all electronic devices to airplane mode, Apollo made a decision. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone. The signal bars were already fading. She had one last chance. She navigated to her favorites list, her thumb hovering over the first entry, Dad. She pressed the call button just as the plane began to push back from the gate. The call connected on the second ring, a small miracle of cellular technology against the metal fuselage. Geordie. Everything? Okay. You should be taking off soon. David Trent's voice was warm and familiar, a comforting anchor in the turbulent sea of Apollo's emotions. Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to stay composed. Something happened. David's tone shifted instantly. The easygoing father vanished, replaced by the razor-sharp focus of a man who had spent 30 years as an airline captain and now ran the most respected aviation safety consulting firm in the country. He could detect a storm in a single shaky word. Talk to me. What happened? The lead flight attendant, Apollo recounted the entire incident, from the hostile greeting at the gate to the bag being thrown and the final humiliating verbal assault. She repeated Flora's words, the phrases that dripped with prejudice girls like you entitled your attitude. She explained how Flora was now painting her as a disruptive passenger. On the other end of the line in his home office, surrounded by aeronautical charts and aircraft models, David Trent listened without interruption. His knuckles whitened as he gripped a pen. He wasn't just hearing about his daughter being bullied. He was hearing a series of procedural red flags and a description of a crew member exhibiting dangerously unstable behavior. When Apollo finished, there was a brief, calculated silence. David didn't respond with emotional fury. He didn't promise to have someone fired, not yet. He responded with questions. Precise, methodical, and strangely technical questions. Apollo, listen to me very carefully. Did the flight attendants make an announcement about a last-minute cargo change or an unusual number of gate-checked bags? Apollo frowned, thinking back through the chaos. I think so. While we were boarding, Flora said something to another attendant about the aft hold being a mess because of all the bags they were having to check. Okay. Good. Now, after they closed the main cabin door, did you see the ground crew hand the lead flight attendant a new piece of paper? Did she take it to the cockpit? This was a specific, odd question. Apollo closed her eyes, replaying the last few minutes. Yes. A guy in a vest handed her a paper. She looked at it, rolled her eyes, and then knocked on the cockpit door. A grim satisfaction settled on David's face. That was the final weight and balance sheet. A last-minute change to cargo or baggage distribution requires a recalculation. It's critical for the aircraft's center of gravity. Okay, Apollo said, not understanding where he was going. Now describe Flora's behavior to me right now. Not before. Right now. Is she erratic? Is she flustered? Is she speaking clearly on the PA system? Apollo peeked down the aisle. Flora was back at the front, strapping herself into her jump seat. Her movements were jerky, angry. She had just finished the safety demonstration, her words spoken at a clipped, resentful pace. She seems really angry, stressed. She practically spat the safety instructions out. Is she fit to fly Geordie? In your opinion, as someone who has been on hundreds of flights, does she seem like a person who could handle an emergency right now? The question was chilling. Could this furious, hateful woman be trusted to guide passengers to safety, to remain calm in a crisis? No, Apollo said honestly. No, she couldn't. This was all David needed. He wasn't going to call the airline and complain about a mean flight attendant. That was a flimsy, he said, she said argument that would get buried in corporate red tape. He was going to pull a thread that could unravel the entire flight based on legitimate, undeniable Federal Aviation Administration regulations. He was going to raise a safety concern. Geordie, your phone is about to cut out. I need you to do exactly as I say. The moment you hang up, press the flight attendant call button. When someone comes, tell them you need to speak to the captain immediately. Tell them you have an urgent safety concern. Use those exact words, urgent safety concern. Do not talk to Flora. If she comes, insist on speaking to another flight attendant or directly to the purser. What's the concern? Dad, the concern has two parts. David said, his voice now cold and hard as steel. First, you have reason to believe the final weight and balance manifest was not properly verified by the flight crew after the extensive last-minute baggage changes. Second, the lead flight attendant is exhibiting erratic and hostile behavior, making you question her fitness for duty under FAA regulations. Tell them your father is Captain David Trent, and that he advised you to make this report. The name was the final, critical piece. In the aviation world, the name Captain David Trent was legendary. He was the pilot who had safely landed a 777 after a catastrophic engine failure over the Pacific. He was the man who had testified before Congress on pilot fatigue. He was the consultant whose firm, Trent Aviation Solutions, held multi-million-dollar contracts with a dozen airlines, including Apex Air, to audit their safety protocols. His name wasn't just a name. It was a weapon of immense credibility. They're going to be angry, Dad. Let them be angry, David said. They can be angry on the ground. You did nothing wrong, Geordie. You were targeted. Now you use the tools I taught you. The rules aren't just for them. They're for you, too. They protect you. Now make the call. I'll handle the rest from here. The line went dead. The plane was turning onto the main taxiway. Apollo took a shaky breath, her fear now being replaced by a cold, resolute purpose. She looked at the call button above her head. She pressed it. The chime echoed in the cabin with an almost comical softness, a polite little ding that belied the gravity of its purpose. A younger flight attendant, a man named Kevin with a much friendlier demeanor, arrived at Apollo's row. "Everything okay here?" he asked with a practiced smile. "I need to speak with the captain." "Apollo," said her voice low but unwavering. She recited the lines her father had given her. "I have an urgent safety concern." Kevin's smile faltered. The phrase urgent safety concern is a trigger in the airline industry. It bypasses all other levels of customer service and goes straight to the flight deck. It implies something far more serious than a request for a blanket. "What is the nature of the concern?" he asked, his training kicking in. "I'd prefer to speak directly with the flight captain, or the purser," Apollo insisted, just as her father had instructed. She wouldn't give Flora the chance to intercept and twist her message. Kevin nodded, his expression now serious. "One moment." He walked to the front of the plane, where he spoke quietly to the purser, an older woman, who then knocked on the cockpit door. From her seat, Apollo could see Flora watching the entire exchange. Her arms crossed, a look of contemptuous disbelief on her face. She clearly thought this was some petulant antic from the teenager she had berated. She rolled her eyes and said something to the purser, likely dismissing it. But the purser ignored her, listening to Kevin and then disappearing into the cockpit. A minute later, the purser re-emerged, her face grim. She walked directly to Apollo's row, pointedly ignoring Flora. "Miss," she said quietly, "can you please repeat your concern to me?" Apollo took a breath and delivered her father's message for the second time. "I have reason to believe the final weight and balance manifest was not properly verified after the significant number of last-minute gate checks. Furthermore, the lead flight attendant has been exhibiting erratic and hostile behavior, and I am concerned about her fitness for duty. My father is Captain David Trent, and he advised me to report this." At the mention of the name David Trent, the purser's face went pale. It was as if Apollo had just invoked the name of an industry god. The purser knew exactly who he was. Every senior employee at Apex Air knew. His firm had conducted their last major safety audit. His face was in their training manuals. The purser nodded slowly, a dawning horror in her eyes. "Thank you. Stay in your seat." She turned and went directly back into the cockpit. This time the door stayed shut for several long minutes. Through the small cockpit window, Apollo could see the runway lights stretching out ahead. The plane was third in line for takeoff. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was this actually going to work? Suddenly, the familiar roar of the engines powering up for takeoff ceased. They spooled down into a low, quiet hum. The plane, which had been inching forward, came to a complete stop. A moment of confused silence fell over the cabin. Then the captain's voice came over the PA system, not with the usual cheerful folks we're next for takeoff, but with a tone that was tight and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Peterson speaking. We're experiencing a minor operational delay. We need to hold our position here on the taxiway for a few moments while we communicate with our operations center. We'll provide you with an update shortly. Cabin crew, please remain seated." Flora, who had been strapped into her jump seat, looked utterly bewildered. A delay now. For what? She stared down the aisle toward Apollo, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. She still hadn't connected the dots. She thought she had won, but her victory was short-lived. A few minutes later, the captain's voice returned, and this time the tension was unmistakable. "Folks, we apologize for the change in plans. We've been instructed to return to the gate. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened as we taxi back to the terminal. We understand this is an inconvenience, and we will provide more information once we are parked and the jet bridge is in place." A collective groan swept through the aircraft. Murmurs of frustration and anger erupted. People had connections to make, meetings to attend. Apollo sank lower in her seat, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, even though they didn't know she was the cause. Susan, the woman beside her, simply reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. As the 737 made the slow, ignominious turn away from the runway, Flora finally understood. Her face, visible to half the plane, cycled through a rapid series of emotions. Confusion, dawning, realization, abject horror, and finally, pure, unadulterated fury. She unbuckled her belt against the captain's orders and stood up. Her eyes locked on Apollo. The purser's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Flora, sit down. Now." Flora froze, her mouth half open. The purser's tone was one of absolute command, a senior officer dressing down a subordinate. Defeated Flora slumped back into her seat, her face a thunderous mask. The power dynamic on Flight 714 had just irrevocably shifted. The teenager in 18B was no longer her victim. She was the catalyst for an unfolding disaster. And as the plane slowly crawled back toward the terminal building, Flora Benson knew, with a cold, sickening certainty, that this was no longer about a carry-on bag. It was about her career. The return to the gate felt like a funeral procession. The mood in the cabin was a sour cocktail of frustration and suspicion. Passengers were grumbling, demanding answers the flight attendants didn't have. Flora remained in her jump seat, rigid and pale, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The moment the engines powered down and the seatbelt sign pinged off, a man in a crisp Apex Air corporate suit appeared at the cabin door. He wasn't a gate agent. He was clearly management. His name was Mr. Donovan, the station's duty manager, and his face was a mask of strained professionalism. He spoke quietly with the purser and Captain Peterson at the cockpit door, before his eyes scanned the cabin and landed on Apollo's row. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. "Miss Trent?" he asked, his voice low. Apollo nodded, her throat dry. "My name is Robert Donovan. Would you be willing to come with me to a more private area to discuss the concerns you raised?" Before Apollo could answer, Susan spoke up. "I'm a witness to the entire incident. I'd like to accompany her if that's all right. She is a minor after all." Mr. Donovan looked relieved. "Of course. Please, both of you follow me." As Apollo and Susan gathered their belongings, whispers and stares followed them. Flora watched them go, her eyes burning with a look of pure hatred. This was her worst nightmare. The complaint was not only being taken seriously, it was being escalated to the highest levels on site. Donovan led them off the plane and into a small, sterile office just off the jet bridge. Waiting for them was another man, older with a calm, authoritative presence. He wasn't wearing an airline uniform. "Apollo." "I'm Kenji Tanaka," the man said, offering a gentle smile. "I work with your father at Trent Aviation Solutions. He called me. I'm based here in Chicago. He asked me to come and make sure you were all right and to assist the airline in their inquiry." The presence of a representative from her father's firm changed the entire dynamic. This wasn't just the airline investigating itself anymore. There was a powerful expert third party in the room. David Trent hadn't just made a call. He had dispatched his cavalry. For the next hour, Apollo calmly and clearly recounted the events, with Susan corroborating every detail. She spoke about Flora's hostility from the start, the violent way she handled both the public shaming and the racially charged language. Susan added her own perspective, describing Flora's behavior as unhinged and completely unprofessional. While they spoke, Donovan's phone buzzed incessantly. The fallout on the plane was escalating. Captain Peterson, now aware of the full context and the name David Trent, had initiated a full safety and personnel review. He had formally logged a fitness for duty concern against Flora. He had also, at the pointed suggestion of Apex Corporate, who had been contacted by David, decided to re-examine the flight paperwork. And that's where Flora's loud, aggressive bullying found its karmic intersection with her professional negligence. The investigation in the office was interrupted when Captain Peterson himself knocked and entered. He looked stressed, his face grim. He addressed Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Donovan, though his apology was directed at Apollo. "Miss Trent," he began on behalf of the flight crew, "I want to sincerely apologize for what you experienced. That behavior is unacceptable on any airline, let alone my aircraft." He then turned to the others. "We've reviewed the weight and balance manifests. It turns out the young lady's father was correct to be concerned. When the last-minute baggage changes were made, a new manifest was generated and delivered. Standard procedure requires that both the lead flight attendant and the captain sign off on the final sheet after a verbal cross-check to confirm the new numbers." Flora brought the sheet to the cockpit, but she was so agitated and distracted from her confrontation that she never initiated the verbal confirmation. She just dropped it off. I mistakenly assumed she had already reviewed it, and I signed off while completing my own pre-flight checklist. We never had the required two-person verification. He paused, letting the weight of the admission sink in. We dug deeper. The numbers on the new sheet were significantly different. The baggage handlers had to shift a large amount of cargo to the forward hold to accommodate the extra bags. According to the data, our center of gravity was at the very edge of the acceptable limit. But it wasn't flagged because the final check was never properly completed. We would have taken off with a configuration that, while technically within limits, was not what I, as captain, had planned for. In an emergency or with unexpected turbulence, it could have been problematic. Flora's unprofessional rage had directly led to a critical safety procedure being skipped. Her personal vendetta against a teenage girl had created a legitimate, verifiable safety risk. Apollo's call hadn't just been about her feelings being hurt. It had exposed a genuine danger. Mr. Donovan looked sick. "The flight is cancelled," he said, rubbing his temples. "We're grounding the aircraft for a full review of the crew and procedures. We'll be rebooking all 148 passengers. This is a nightmare." The investigation was swift. Flora was called off the plane and into a separate office. Her union representative was summoned. But there was no defense. They had witness testimony from Apollo and Susan. They had corroborating statements from other passengers who had come forward. They had a formal complaint from the captain himself. And most damning of all, they had the signed but improperly verified weight and balance sheet, a clear breach of federal aviation regulations. Flora's career wasn't just in jeopardy, it was over. The unraveling was total public and a direct result of her own actions. For Flora Benson, the world tilted on its axis and spun out of control with nauseating speed. One moment she was the queen of her metal tube, a 25-year veteran whose authority was absolute. The next she was sitting in a windowless office under the flat, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights being questioned by men who had once been her peers and were now her judges. She tried to fight back, of course. She fell back on her practiced narrative. The girl had been the problem. She was insolent, with a bad attitude. She claimed Apollo had refused to comply with instructions, forcing her to take action. She painted herself as the victim, a dedicated employee, just trying to maintain order and ensure an on-time departure. But her story crumbled under the slightest pressure. "So you're saying Miss Trent was disruptive?" Mr. Donovan asked, his voice devoid of sympathy. "That's interesting because we have a statement from the passenger in 18A, a Mr. Henderson, who states that you were shouting and that the girl barely spoke. We have another from a passenger in 19C who called your behavior an abusive tirade. They're siding with her." Flora spat, her voice cracking. "They don't understand the pressure we're under." "And the bag," Captain Peterson chimed in, his tone ice. "You stated her bag was too large for the overhead bin, yet multiple witnesses and the girl herself stated it fit perfectly. You removed it, and in doing so dropped it and created a mess in the aisle, further delaying the flight. Is that correct?" Flora stammered. "It was an accident. She got in my way." The lies were transparent, pathetic. Every point she tried to make was immediately refuted by a growing pile of witness statements and the damning report from her own captain. Her colleagues, the very flight attendants who had silently watched her attack Apollo, were now giving their own statements to protect themselves. They described Flora as stressed out and on edge all morning. No one was defending her. In the cold, hard calculus of corporate liability, she was a sinking ship they were all fleeing. The final nail in her coffin was the safety violation. There was no way to spin it. Her signature was on a document she hadn't properly checked, a document that was critical to the safety of the flight. Her personal meltdown had led directly to a major professional failure. She was suspended on the spot pending a full investigation, which everyone in the room knew was a formality. She was escorted out of the airport, not through the bustling terminal, but through a series of grey anonymous service corridors stripped of her wings and her dignity. The passengers from Flight 742, now deplaned and queuing angrily at the customer service desk, caught glimpses of her being led away, her face a mask of shame and fury. The whispers followed her like a shadow. In the days that followed, the karma hit harder. Apex Air's legal department, terrified of a lawsuit from the industry behemoth David Trent, moved to sever all ties. Flora was fired for gross misconduct and violation of safety protocols. The FAA was officially notified of the incident, triggering a review of her flight attendant certification. Her union, while obligated to provide a defense, knew it was a losing battle. They couldn't defend both her behavior and the blatant safety breach. The story, as these things often do, leaked. An anonymous passenger blogged about the meltdown on Apex 714. A local news station picked it up. Soon the tale of the flight attendant who grounded a plane because she bullied a teenager was making the rounds on social media. Flora Benson became, for a brief time, a viral villain. Her name was dragged through the mud, her actions dissected and condemned by millions who hadn't been there. She had sought to publicly humiliate a child, and in return, she was subjected to a public shaming on a scale she could never have imagined. She lost her job, her reputation and the career she had built over a quarter of a century. She found herself unemployable in the industry she knew. The airlines all talked, and no one would touch a flight attendant fired for such a toxic combination of passenger abuse and safety negligence. Her pride, which had curdled into arrogance and cruelty, had cost her everything. The power she had wielded so carelessly on that plane was gone, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of the consequences. Meanwhile, Apollo and Susan were treated like VIPs. The airline rebooked them on the next flight to San Diego in first class. They offered apologies, travel vouchers, and anything else they could think of to appease them. Apollo accepted the apology politely, but refused the extras. She didn't want compensation. She wanted accountability. And she had gotten it. As she sat in the spacious first-class seat, soaring above the clouds, she felt a profound sense of relief, but also a lingering sadness. It should never have come to this. It should never have required a powerful father and a secret weapon of a phone call. Justice shouldn't be a privilege. But she was also proud. She had faced down a bully, not by stooping to her level, but by staying calm, remembering her father's lessons, and using the system's own rules as a shield and a sword. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had exposed a danger that could have affected everyone on that flight. The storm was over. Weeks turned into a tranquil month in San Diego. The salty air and the rhythmic crash of the Pacific waves against the shore worked as a slow-acting balm on Apollo's frayed nerves. The incident on Flight 714 was no longer a raw, open wound, but a scar that was beginning to fade into memory. yet it remained a defining one. There were moments, sitting on her grandmother's porch with her sketchbook open, where the gentle hiss of the tide would momentarily sound like the recycled air of the cabin, and the image of Flora's face contorted in rage would flash behind her eyes. She would have to take a deep breath, focusing on the pelicans gliding in the distance to remind herself that she was here safe and grounded. She spent many of those evenings talking with her father, who had flown out to join her for the last week of her stay. Their conversations were different now, imbued with a new weight. He saw her not just as his daughter, but as a young woman who had navigated a crucible and emerged stronger. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, she finally voiced the question that had been lingering in the quiet corners of her mind. "Did I do the right thing, Dad? I mean, really." She lost everything. Her whole career. Was a mean comment and a thrown bag worth all that David Trent turned from the railing to look at his daughter. He saw the empathy in her eyes, the characteristic kindness that made him so proud, but which could also be a vulnerability. He chose his words with the same precision he used in a cockpit. "Geordie, you didn't take her career." She threw it away. "You just happened to be the one who was there when she did it. What you need to understand is that what she did was born from a sense of absolute impunity," he said, the word hanging in the air. She'd probably gotten away with that kind of low-grade bullying for years. People are intimidated. They don't want to make a scene, and the system is often designed to protect employees over customers in he said, she said situations. She got comfortable. She got arrogant. She forgot that the rules she used as a weapon against others also applied to her. More so, in fact. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Never confuse the catalyst with the cause. The cause was her unprofessionalism, her prejudice, and her dangerous lack of composure. Your call was just the catalyst that forced the system to finally see it. Think about it. Her anger made her careless. That carelessness led her to skip a vital safety check. What if there had been a real emergency on that flight? Could anyone have trusted that woman in that state of mind to lead them to safety? You didn't just stand up for yourself, Apollo. You exposed a weak link in the safety chain that protects hundreds of people every day. His words clicked into place, reframing the narrative in her mind. It hadn't been a personal vendetta. It had been a necessary action. The official news that trickled in over the following weeks confirmed it. David shared the communications with her. Apex Air sent a formal, exhaustive letter of apology detailing the internal review the incident on Flight 742 had triggered. They were implementing new mandatory training modules on de-escalation and implicit bias awareness. Captain Peterson received a formal reprimand for his part in the paperwork lapse, a black mark on an otherwise perfect record that David knew would sting the professional pilot's pride. The most significant news came from the Federal Aviation Administration. Their investigation, prompted by the official report from Apex, was swift and decisive. They concluded that Flora Benson had demonstrated a reckless disregard for standard operating procedures and passenger welfare. Her flight attendant certificate, the license that was the bedrock of her entire professional life, was revoked indefinitely. She would never legally be able to work as cabin crew on a U.S. carrier again. The system had not just punished her, it had removed her. A month after returning to Chicago, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. It was postmarked from a small town in Illinois, and the return address read, Susan Miller. Apollo's heart gave a little leap. She opened it to find a handwritten letter on elegant stationery. Dear Apollo, I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought of you often since that day at O'Hare. I wanted to reach out and say again how deeply impressed I was by your composure and courage. In 30 years as a high school teacher, I have seen bullying in many forms from the schoolyard to the staff room. I've rarely seen it dismantled so elegantly and effectively. You were targeted for no reason, and when you were verbally attacked, you did not crumble, and you did not retaliate in kind. You did not raise your voice. You did not resort to insults. You simply activated a system of accountability that your attacker thought she was immune to. You forced the rules to apply to everyone equally. It was a master class in quiet strength, and it's a lesson I will share with my students for years to come. I hope you know what a powerful thing you did that day, not just for yourself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel small by someone in a position of authority. Never lose that strength. Warmly, Susan Miller. Your friend from 18C. Apollo read the letter twice, a slow, warm feeling spreading through her chest. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, not of sadness, but of profound validation. Susan's words meant more than any corporate apology. This was a confirmation from a stranger who owed her nothing, a witness who had simply seen the truth and affirmed it. The letter helped heal the last of the lingering self-doubt. The final quiet conclusion to the saga arrived 6 months later on a snowy Tuesday night. Apollo was deep into research for a civics class project on corporate accountability, ironically. Typing Apex Air. Employee complaints into a search engine, she scrolled through corporate press releases and legal blogs. Then a link from a small local news aggregator from a town in Wisconsin caught her eye. Community spotlight finding work after a career change. Curiosity piqued, she clicked. The article was a soft focus piece on local residents who had rebooted their lives after being laid off. And there, halfway down the page, was a photograph. The woman in it was familiar, but diminished. The severe, immaculate bun was gone, replaced by limp, tired hair. The crisp, authoritative uniform was gone, replaced by a drab, ill-fitting red smock worn over a faded turtleneck. The look of imperious command she had wielded with such menace was gone, replaced by a permanent expression of weary, deep-set resentment. The nameplate on her smock was blurry, but the caption underneath was crystal clear. Flora Benson, a new cashier at the town's Value Mart stocks shelves after a long career in the airline industry. Apollo stared at the image, her breath catching in her throat. There was no surge of joy, no triumphant feeling of victory. Seeing her like this didn't feel good. It just felt final. It was the quiet, grinding reality of karma. Flora hadn't just lost a job. She had been stripped of the power and status she had so clearly cherished and abused. She was now in a role where she had to serve, to be polite, to answer to managers, and deal with impatient customers, all the things she had demanded of others, but had failed to do herself. Her punishment wasn't a dramatic, fiery crash, but a long, slow, mundane descent into the very powerlessness she had tried to inflict on a teenage girl. Apollo closed the laptop, the faint glow of the screen vanishing from her face. She had not set out to destroy a woman's life. She had only wanted to get to her grandmother's house and be treated with basic human decency. But when that was denied, she had been forced to protect herself using the tools her father had given her. The incident had carved a new understanding into her soul. The world contained people like Flora, who would try to make her feel small because of who she was. But it also contained people like Susan, and it was governed by rules that, if you were calm enough and smart enough to use them, could be a powerful force for justice. She picked up her sketchbook, the very one that had been in her backpack that day, and opened it to a clean page. With a steady hand, she began to draw the view from her window, the intricate dance of snowflakes against the dark city sky. She was no longer just the girl in 18B. She was the one who had made the call, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would never again be afraid to make it. The story of Apollo Trent and Flora Benson is a stark reminder that true power doesn't come from a uniform or a title, but from knowledge, composure, and the courage to stand up against injustice. Apollo didn't win by shouting louder, she won by being smarter. She turned a flight attendant's personal prejudice into a question of public safety, a masterful move that made the situation impossible for the airline to ignore. It shows us that systems of accountability, while sometimes seeming distant, can be incredibly potent when activated correctly. Karma in this story wasn't a mystical force. It was the logical, inevitable consequence of one woman's arrogance crashing against a teenager's quiet strength. If this story of karmic justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And for more true stories of people turning the tables on those who wronged them, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Thank you for listening.